we're using the term out season. Just kind of really quickly delineate out season and off season, and why you make that point to use different terminology.
Right. So a lot with off season comes, taking off of training, not training anymore, and that used to be the habit of a lot of athletes. It's still the mentality of some. We actually did a survey just, I guess, this past week or so. We had more than 700 respondents, and we found that only 11% of the athletes were going to take more than 4 weeks off after the season was over. For that, so that time between seasons isn't really an off time. We consider it, we aren't racing, so it's not in season, so it's just out season. And so we approach it a little differently. There's a lot of different things you can do in training during the season. Your training is restricted to, or I guess the requirements of your race distance. If you're doing an iron race or a long course race, there's certain things you have to do in training to finish that distance. And so that can often inhibit people from progressing and getting faster and more developed in the sport. And when in the out season, when you remove that requirement of a race distance, it allows us just to work on athletes, whatever they need to do to be better athletes, to better serve. So they don't have this restriction of an imminent race. They can become more powerful, increase their threshold, work on mechanics. They can do a whole lot of things. So it's a very unique time. And thinking of it as an out season versus off season, it can be very personal. So even though there's races going on, maybe March, in the U.S. anyway, March through November, if you're only racing the latter half of the season, you can have an out season in the spring where you're doing some of the same principles and that same type of training during that time. So it's kind of any time when your next big race is more than about 4 months out, we call it about that. And then there's some other stuff, difference between out season and in season that you look at differently, being without that looming race. A lot of times when your stress level's down, you might not be as anxious about it, but you're also not as excited about it or as motivated. So a lot of times consistency can suffer, and motivation and being intentional about your training, as well as the weather. I mean, that impacts a lot of people during their out season. They're going indoors and doing things differently. So, teaching them to learn how to use trainers more effectively, compi trainers, stationary trainers, even without power, doing videos like your cycling series. I mean, that's just huge for doing stuff like that to keep you working, pushing hard, get the sense of people around you sometimes when you're solitary and inside. So it can actually be the most productive part of the whole year. More of an athlete's success and improvement can happen during the out season than any other time of the whole year, including the race prep period. We actually had an athlete, it was last year, never done an Ironman before, trained for 15 months and did 2 out-season programs prior to going into his last phase, which was a race prep phase. He did Ironman Mont Tremblant, and he didn't have a background at all doing triathlons or any other sport. He was about 37, 38 years old. He did 11:38 on no more than 15 hours training in any 1 week. He only had 2 weeks over 15 hours. The bulk of the rest were 13 hours and less. So just to get incredible results out of that amount of time, but spending it wisely and planning your training phases and using that out-season phase effectively can generate more productivity for an athlete than any other phase.
Well, it seems like it seems that it's, not to get too existential, but it seems like it's a time to sort of find yourself, whereas during the season you might think, well, I have to concentrate on this. I have no real time to learn anything different. You sort of can you find people can make themselves sort of a blank canvas project during this out season and use tools like yours to paint on that?
Absolutely. So that's the time. There's a lot of things that athletes will do during that time. One is if you're getting a new bike or a new fit, changing the way you run. I know even you guys have that Bobby McGee's Run Mechanics DVD. I really recommend that for a lot of my athletes who are trying to rework or improve their run mechanics. And a lot of times when you change your gait, if you're doing very high volume and trying to make those big change, you can have injury during that time. So the out season is the time when your runs tend to be shorter, and you can make changes like that. And really, like you said, a blank canvas, kind of start over, retrain yourself, how to run or improve swim stroke or anything like that.
Great, yeah, it's funny. You've so far mentioned